It's a Sunday afternoon in Budapest, and something unprecedented just happened in the Ferrari garage that nobody's talking about openly, but everyone in the paddock already knows. Fred Vasseur has essentially drawn a line in the red asphalt, and it's not directed at Mercedes or McLaren, it's directed at his own driver. Lewis Hamilton, seven-time world champion, fresh off his record-breaking move to Maranello, just received what insiders are calling the most significant operational warning of his entire career. But here's what makes this story absolutely fascinating. This wasn't about performance on track. This was about something far deeper, something that threatens to completely destabilize Ferrari's entire 2026 championship campaign from the inside out. For weeks, rumors circulated through the Formula One paddock. Conversations happened behind closed doors, in motorhomes, and during strategy briefings that the cameras never captured. And then, just as tensions were building to a breaking point, Vasseur made his move. Not through a public statement or a press release, but through something far more calculated, a direct operational mandate that sent shockwaves through the team. The message was crystal clear. Both Lewis Hamilton and Charles Leclerc need to understand exactly where the lines are drawn, what's expected from them, and what will absolutely not be tolerated moving forward. This is the story of how Ferrari's dream partnership started showing the first real cracks, and why the coming races could decide not just championships, but the future of one of the most significant driver pairings in modern Formula One history. The context here is absolutely crucial. Leclerc has been on a tear. We're not talking about minor improvements or marginal gains. The Monegasque driver orchestrated a stunning victory at Silverstone that nobody saw coming, dominated in Belgium, and consistently delivered strong performances in Hungary. While these weren't knockout performances against Hamilton specifically, they shifted something fundamental within the team's internal dynamics. The points gap that looked insurmountable just a few weeks ago has compressed to just 31 points. That's not a typo. 31 points between teammates in the middle of a Formula One season means one good stretch, a couple of solid strategic calls, and some favorable race circumstances can completely flip the equation. Suddenly, Leclerc's resurgence wasn't just about his own performance. It was a statement that challenged the entire narrative Ferrari had built around Hamilton's recruitment. Think about what Ferrari had communicated when they signed Hamilton. They'd essentially positioned him as their championship reference point, their seven-time world champion who would lead the team's assault on the constructors and drivers' championships. But Leclerc just proved that narrative wasn't as straightforward as it seemed. He wasn't some secondary player waiting for his time. He was a competitor who could match Hamilton when the conditions aligned, and the Ferrari suited his driving style. This is where Vasseur's challenge becomes incredibly complex. You can't simply say, Lewis is the team leader, so we'll build the team around him, when the alternative driver is producing this level of performance. You also can't create a situation where internal rivalry becomes destructive, or where one driver feels undermined by team management. That's the tightrope Vasseur is walking, and apparently he walked a little too close to one edge. Reports from multiple reliable sources within the Ferrari organization indicate that Vasseur held a significant operational meeting with both drivers, but more importantly, with the engineering and strategy teams. The message wasn't ambiguous or couched in diplomatic language. Vasseur made it abundantly clear that Ferrari operates on a merit-based system, not a driver hierarchy system. That might sound obvious when you hear it stated directly, but in Formula One context, it's remarkably controversial. For decades, Ferrari has been known for favoring one driver over another, creating clear team leader dynamics that sometimes undermine performance and occasionally created internal friction that cost the team championships. Vasseur was essentially saying, those days are over, and any driver who expects preferential treatment is fundamentally misunderstanding how this team operates under his leadership. The no favoritism directive becomes even more significant when you understand the history here. Lewis Hamilton came to Ferrari after winning 7 world championships and being Mercedes' clear number one for years. At Mercedes, there were understood hierarchies, strategic preferences, and operational structures that generally favored the more accomplished driver. But Vasseur's statement was basically rejecting that entire framework. He's saying that Ferrari will judge every driver solely on their performance, their commitment, their ability to deliver under pressure, and their willingness to work within the team's strategic framework. No exceptions, regardless of driver history or championship credentials. This is a fundamental reset of expectations that, according to paddock sources, didn't go down particularly smoothly in all conversations. But it's the third component of Vasseurs' demands that really escalated tensions: the wheel-to-wheel racing regulations. Following several incidents involving Hamilton and Leclerc during on-track battles, nothing catastrophic or championship-threatening, but notable nonetheless, Vasseur apparently laid down explicit operational parameters about how internal competition would be managed. The directive essentially states that while Ferrari welcomes competitive driving and wants both drivers pushing each other to higher performance levels, there are absolute boundaries that cannot be crossed. Any on-track incident between teammates that jeopardizes the Constructors' Championship standing, that damages cars, or that creates negative team dynamics will result in immediate strategic intervention. More importantly, drivers who consistently flirt with these boundaries will find their strategic priority diminished or their development resources reallocated. This is where it becomes genuinely fascinating from a strategic perspective. You can't simply say Lewis is the team leader, so we'll build the team around him, when the alternative driver is producing this level of performance. You also can't create a situation where internal rivalry becomes destructive or where one driver feels undermined by team management. That's the tightrope Vasseur is walking, and apparently he walked a little too close to one edge. With Ferrari's championship prospects as the central consideration. Now, here's what's genuinely interesting about Lewis Hamilton's specific situation. Behind the scenes, and this is where the internal dynamics get quite complex, Hamilton has been remarkably demanding technically. He hasn't just accepted Ferrari's current technical direction, he's been pushing extensively for specific modifications and alternative components that align with his driving style and preferences. The carbon industry's brake disc situation is perhaps the most visible example, but sources indicate this is part of a broader pattern where Hamilton has been consistently advocating for technical adjustments. In isolation, this is completely normal and expected. Every driver brings feedback, pushes for development, and works to optimize their car. But when this technical push comes alongside a compressed points gap with your teammate, and you're producing fewer victories than expected, the operational optics shift considerably. Vasseur's response to Hamilton's technical demands reportedly evolved from agreement to something closer to conditional acceptance. Early in the season, when Hamilton was clearly establishing dominance, Vasseur seemed receptive to most technical suggestions. Hamilton was winning, the points advantage was substantial, and investing in his comfort made strategic sense. But as Leclerc's performances improved and the gap narrowed, Vasseur's perspective apparently shifted. The message became clearer. Technical development is valuable, but only if it translates directly to improved on-track performance. Hamilton's technical feedback is welcome, but Ferrari will evaluate these suggestions based on engineering merit and strategic impact, not simply because a 7-time world champion is requesting them. This brings us to the performance bar that Vasseur has effectively reset. According to multiple reports from Ferrari insiders, Vasseur has made it clear that while Ferrari respects Hamilton's input and his technical knowledge, the team ultimately expects absolute execution on track. The technical development, the brake disc experiments, the setup refinements, all of this is only valuable if Hamilton converts it into wins and championships. It's not enough to develop a car that feels more comfortable, it must translate into competitive advantage. This is actually a pretty bold statement in some ways, because it's essentially saying your comfort, your preferences, your technical needs, these all matter, but only insofar as they contribute to measurable results. If Hamilton pushes for a technical change that doesn't yield improvements, Ferrari's engineering team will potentially redirect resources elsewhere. The broader context for all of this is Ferrari's championship ambitions. The team is genuinely competitive this season. They're not fighting for survival or rebuilding, they're fighting for the Constructors' Championship. That's a title that matters enormously to Ferrari, perhaps more than individual driver championships. From Vasseur's perspective, every strategic decision, every technical resource, every moment of team energy needs to be channeled toward that objective. When Hamilton's technical demands distract from that mission, or when Leclerc's resurgence creates internal competition that threatens the team's unified direction, Vasseur needs to apply direct management to reset focus. That's exactly what he's apparently done. What's really remarkable about this entire situation is how quickly Leclerc's recent form has altered the internal power structure at Ferrari. Just weeks ago, the narrative was established. Lewis Hamilton joins Ferrari, immediately demonstrates his quality, and leads the team's assault on Mercedes and other competitors. The 31-point advantage looked insurmountable. But Charles Leclerc doesn't read scripts. He doesn't follow predetermined narratives. He drove his heart out through multiple consecutive races and completely altered the perspective on what's possible within this team. When you win at Silverstone, one of the most prestigious venues in Formula One, deeply connected to British racing heritage, against the 7-time world champion who spent his entire career dominating in the UK, that sends a message far beyond the points gained. It says, your historical narratives don't apply here. This is a competition, and I'm competitive. The psychological dimension of Leclerc's resurgence is something that Vasseur clearly recognized needed to be managed. If Leclerc continues this trajectory and eventually matches Hamilton's points tally or even surpasses it, Ferrari faces a genuinely complex situation. Do they then pivot to protecting Leclerc? Do they restructure the team around his rising performance? Do they recalibrate their entire operational framework based on updated performance data? These are exactly the types of questions that create chaos within team structures if not managed carefully. Vasseur's preemptive move, establishing that Ferrari operates on merit, that no driver is protected, and that internal competition must exist within defined boundaries, is essentially future-proofing the team against scenarios where one driver's success could destabilize the broader operation. But there's another layer here that's genuinely fascinating. Leclerc seems to respond well to certain technical characteristics of the Ferrari. His recent performances suggest he's found a rhythm with the current car configuration that plays to his strengths. Meanwhile, Hamilton has been more critical of certain aspects and has been requesting modifications. Now, this doesn't mean one driver is right and another is wrong. Formula One is complex enough that different drivers can genuinely prefer different technical approaches. But it does create a situation where Ferrari might face genuine tension between optimizing the car for Hamilton or keeping it in a configuration that suits Leclerc. Vasseur's performance-based mandate essentially says, we'll make changes based on engineering merit and strategic impact, not based on which driver is more comfortable. That's a framework that protects the team's interests while still allowing both drivers to compete effectively. The history of Ferrari team management actually provides important context here. The team has a long track record of mismanaging internal driver dynamics, creating favorites and allowing competitive situations between teammates to deteriorate into actual chaos. That's cost them championships, multiple championships if we're being honest. Prost and Senna created drama. Multiple Schumacher-era situations created complexity. More recently, other teammate pairings sometimes fractured in ways that damaged team performance. Vasseur is clearly determined to not let Ferrari repeat this pattern. By establishing clear operational boundaries and emphasizing that Ferrari's competitive interests come before any individual driver's preferences or ego, he's attempting to create a professional framework that can contain competitive tension without allowing it to become destructive. What makes this particularly interesting is that Hamilton himself has never really experienced this type of management structure. At Mercedes, he was clearly the team's focal point. His preferences mattered. His technical feedback was given extraordinary weight. He had leverage because his performance was so dominant that it was rational for Mercedes to prioritize his comfort and preferences. But Ferrari is saying, essentially, that was Mercedes' choice. This is Ferrari's choice, and Ferrari's choice is different. It's a reset moment, and according to paddock reports, it wasn't the most comfortable message for Hamilton to receive. But it's also not surprising that Vasseur would deliver it. He's running a team that needs to win championships, and he's not going to allow individual driver preferences to complicate that mission, regardless of who the driver is. If you think about Formula One at its most sophisticated level, it's not just about driver skill, though that matters enormously. It's about the interaction between driver preferences, technical capability, engineering innovation, and strategic decision-making. Lewis Hamilton has spent his entire career deeply involved in technical development. At Mercedes, he wasn't just a driver, he was a central part of the engineering dialogue. He contributed to car design discussions, brake system selection, aerodynamic philosophy, and countless other technical decisions. He doesn't just drive the car that Mercedes builds, he actively participates in building it. That's part of what makes him so valuable to a team. His technical input combined with his driving ability creates a compounding effect. But Ferrari currently faces an interesting challenge. Hamilton's technical feedback is undoubtedly valuable. He spent decades at the highest level of this sport and understands car dynamics at a level few drivers do. However, implementing his feedback requires engineering resources, design decisions, and strategic focus. Every hour of engineering time spent refining something for Hamilton is an hour not spent on something else. Every compromise made to favor his technical preferences is a compromise not made for something that might benefit the overall team. Vasseur is essentially saying, we'll listen to your feedback, we'll consider your technical input, but we're going to evaluate it through a lens of whether it actually contributes to championship success. If it does, great, we'll implement it. If it doesn't, or if it creates more problems than it solves, we're going to pass and focus resources elsewhere. The carbon industry's brake disc situation provides a concrete example of how this is playing out. Hamilton apparently has been pushing for a transition away from Brembo's brake systems toward an alternative supplier whose components align better with his driving style and preferences. This isn't an unreasonable request. Different brake systems do have different characteristics, and finding the right match for a driver's technique can yield measurable performance improvements. But implementing this change would involve extensive testing, validation, potential recalibration of other systems that interact with the brakes, and development investment. Vasseur's position, according to reports, is that if the brake change delivers measurable performance gains in testing and track conditions, Ferrari will consider it. But they're not going to make it happen simply because Hamilton has requested it. The evaluation will be objective, based on data and results, not on driver hierarchy or preferences. This approach actually reflects a subtle but important shift in how Ferrari operates compared to some historical precedent. The old Ferrari model sometimes involved accommodating a clear number one driver to the point where it became inefficient or even counterproductive. Vasseur is essentially saying that Ferrari is going to be more rigorous about technical decisions. Every modification will be evaluated for its actual impact on performance. Every resource allocation will be based on whether it contributes to championship outcomes. It's a more systematic, less personality-driven approach to technical development. For a driver like Hamilton, who's used to his technical input being given enormous weight, this represents a different dynamic than he's experienced before. But here's what's genuinely smart about Vasseur's approach. He's not rejecting Hamilton's technical input. He's not saying your ideas don't matter or we're not going to listen to your feedback. He's saying we value your feedback, but we're going to evaluate it objectively and implement it only if it objectively improves our competitive position. That's actually a position that's very difficult to argue against. If you're driving for a team that wants to win championships, and that team commits to implementing any technical suggestion that demonstrably improves performance, then what you're really asking for beyond that is special treatment. And special treatment is precisely what Vasseur said isn't available at Ferrari. The interesting subtext here is that this technical management approach might actually benefit Leclerc significantly. If Leclerc's feedback is also being evaluated on the same merit-based criteria, then both drivers are theoretically getting fair consideration. But if the current car happens to suit Leclerc's driving style well, and Hamilton is requesting modifications that move the car away from that baseline, then Ferrari faces a choice: accommodate Hamilton's preferences and potentially underperform with Leclerc, or maintain a technical direction that suits Leclerc and potentially frustrate Hamilton. Vasseur's framework essentially says, we're not making this choice based on driver hierarchy. We're making it based on what delivers the best overall results for the team. If that happens to favor one driver's preferences over another, that's the outcome of objective evaluation, not favoritism. Let's talk about what's really at stake here, because this situation is directly connected to Ferrari's championship prospects. The Constructors' Championship is Ferrari's priority. They've made that clear. They're competing against Mercedes. They're trying to overtake McLaren. They're in an active arms race with multiple competitors. Every strategic decision matters. Every tenth of a second gained or lost in development matters. Every race result impacts the championship standings. From this perspective, Vasseur's management of internal competition becomes a championship strategy issue, not just a personnel issue. If Hamilton and Leclerc are constantly battling for superiority within the team, if they're pushing for contradictory technical directions, if they're creating internal friction about resource allocation and strategic focus, that benefits Mercedes. Competition. Mercedes knows this dynamic is happening. McLaren knows. Every other team on the grid benefits when Ferrari's internal energy is consumed managing driver politics instead of focused exclusively on competitive performance. So Vasseur's directive, which basically says compete with each other but only within parameters that protect our team interests, is actually a strategic weapon. It forces both drivers to channel their competitiveness constructively rather than destructively. But this also creates pressure on Hamilton specifically in ways that are worth examining. Leclerc's resurgence means Hamilton can't take anything for granted. He can't assume that Ferrari's resources will be allocated primarily to his campaign. He can't bank on preferential treatment that might have been implicit in his contract. He has to perform. He has to win. He has to deliver results that justify continued resource allocation and strategic focus. This is probably different from Mercedes, where Lewis was so dominant that strategic questions essentially resolved in his favor. At Ferrari, he's now in a situation where he has to defend his position through on-track performance. That's actually more competitive, more merit-based, and arguably more healthy for the team's championship prospects, but it's also undoubtedly more demanding for Hamilton personally. The Constructors' Championship implications are also important when you think about team strategy. If Hamilton and Leclerc are locked in an internal battle, Ferrari has to carefully manage their strategic interactions. You can't have situations where team strategy needs to dictate that one driver should fall back to protect the other, or that one driver's race should be sacrificed for the other's benefit, if that's going to create a culture of grievance or resentment. But you also need to be able to make these strategic calls when they make sense for the team's championship. Vasseur's framework apparently addresses this by establishing that strategic calls will be made based on objective evaluation of championship consequences, not based on driver preferences. If the strategy suggests one driver should be protected for a race, that decision will be made based on points implications, not on which driver is more prominent. Here's where it gets genuinely complex. Mercedes is apparently a similar challenge for different reasons. According to reports, Kimi Antonelli is performing at an unexpectedly high level for what was supposed to be a reserve driver situation. Mercedes is pushing harder than most expected, and Ferrari is keenly aware of that threat. In this context, Hamilton's performance for Ferrari becomes even more critical. The team doesn't have the luxury of managing two drivers who are both underperforming. They need both Hamilton and Leclerc delivering consistently. Vasseur's warning to Hamilton essentially incorporates this pressure. The bar for acceptable performance is high, the expectation for results is clear, and the team's championship aspirations depend on both drivers executing at elite levels. This isn't just about internal Ferrari dynamics, it's about external championship competition. Now, the massive question that everyone in the paddock is asking is, where does the situation actually go from here? Has Vasseur effectively reset the internal dynamics of Ferrari, or has he potentially created tension that could fester and undermine team performance? The answer probably depends on how Hamilton responds to this management moment. If he accepts the framework, focuses on delivering results, and works within Vasseur's operational parameters, then this could become a forgotten moment, just a necessary clarification of expectations that keeps everything functioning smoothly. But if Hamilton perceives this as diminishment or as Vasseur taking Leclerc's side, then it could create problems that extend well beyond the season. The interesting thing about Hamilton's career is that he's faced management challenges before, but they've typically happened in different contexts. There was tension at McLaren early in his career, but he was a young driver without leverage. There was the occasional friction with Mercedes, but he was so dominant that the friction generally resolved in his favor. At Ferrari, it's a different situation. He's older, he's transitioning to a new team, and he's facing a teammate who's performing at his own level. That's a genuinely novel situation for Hamilton, and how he navigates it will say something important about his character and professionalism. Based on what's known about Hamilton, he's likely to respond by focusing on performance. He'll probably work within Vasseur's framework and try to demonstrate through results that he deserves the strategic and resource allocation priorities he's accustomed to. The Constructors' Championship remains achievable for Ferrari, which means Vasseur's management approach could work out brilliantly if both drivers perform at high levels and the team executes strategically. But if the internal management situation creates psychological friction that manifests as decreased performance, then Vasseur's warning could backfire. The key variable is whether both drivers internalize the message as "we're going to be managed fairly and objectively" versus "the team is managing me because the other driver is getting preferential treatment." That perception is everything. Looking at the broader Formula One landscape, this Ferrari situation also has implications for how top teams manage elite drivers going forward. For decades, Formula One operated under the assumption that you hire the best driver you can, and then you build everything around that driver. You give them the car they want, the setup they prefer, the strategic focus they demand. But Vasseur is essentially experimenting with a different model. Hire the best driver you can and the best teammate you can, and then manage both of them according to a framework of objective merit and team priorities. It's a model that prioritizes team success over individual accommodation. It might work brilliantly, or it might create complications, but it's certainly worth paying attention to because it represents a different philosophy than what we've typically seen. The technical development path forward will also be worth monitoring. If Ferrari implements Hamilton's brake suggestions and they deliver measurable improvements, that becomes a vindication of his technical feedback and supports his standing within the team. If they don't deliver improvements, it becomes an example of Vasseur's point about objective evaluation trumping driver preferences. Similarly, if Leclerc's technical feedback gets implemented and yields benefits, that strengthens his position. The engineering team's decisions over the next few races and development cycles will actually be speaking louder than any official statements. Those decisions will reveal whether Vasseur's merit-based approach is being applied consistently or if there's hidden hierarchy that contradicts the official messaging. The coming races will be absolutely crucial in this narrative. If Hamilton bounces back with a string of victories and reasserts clear dominance over Leclerc, the points gap expands and this management moment fades as a footnote. But if Leclerc continues performing at his elevated level and further compresses the gap, then this situation takes on completely different dimensions. Vasseur's framework will be tested in real time with genuine championship stakes involved. And that's when we'll really understand whether his management philosophy is sustainable, or if Ferrari's internal dynamics start to unravel under the pressure of competing external championship battles and competitive uncertainty between teammates. That's the story that's actually going to unfold over the next several weeks, and honestly, it's absolutely riveting from a Formula One perspective. This is team management and championship competition colliding in real time.